Good morning, everybody. I'm Edward Mayer, Chairman of the City Club of Chicago. Welcome to our program this morning. Our speaker will be the 5th District Congressman from the state of Illinois, Mike Quigley, who is beginning his 7th term representing the citizens of the 5th District in the United States Congress. Prior to his being a member of the United States House of Representatives, Congressman Quigley was a Cook County Commissioner, and prior to that, he was involved in all sorts of community services in the Lakewood neighborhood. He's taken time from his very busy schedule in Washington, D.C. this morning to join with us and bring us up to date on some of the issues that confront Congressman Quigley. Congressman Quigley is a member of the House Committee on Appropriations, and he has used his position to prioritize investments in innovation and Chicago area infrastructure, which help grow our local economy and spur job creation. Mike Quigley currently serves as the chair of the Subcommittee on Financial Services and General Government. In 2015, he was appointed by Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi to serve on the influential House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, representing Chicago. Mike brings to the committee a very unique understanding of the national security challenges we face, and he has championed many policies that keep America safe. Congressman Quigley is one of the co-founders and co-chair of the Bipartisan Congressional Transparency Caucus, where he has introduced landmark legislation that significantly strengthens oversight at all branches of the federal government, and he utilizes 21st century technology to expand public access to information. Congressman Quigley is a leader on many of our nation's most challenging and significant issues. Among many, he continues to fight for full LGBT equality as vice chair of the LGBT Equality Caucus, as well as a woman's right to choose and common sense gun law reforms that will make our communities safer. We want to thank the Congressman for joining us, and we want to thank our sponsor today, Patrick Cermak, for contributing to this program. Congressman Quigley, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ed. It's great to be back. Speaking to the City Club is always a highlight of the year. I am also missing my Italian dinner that usually came before. I just finished dessert and ready to go, but this will have to do. Yeah, and I think the in-person stuff is what we really miss. I was telling my staff the other day that going to community meetings again, we're starting to see it happen. The Earth Day events starting to happen. You miss the human touch, whether someone pats you on the back saying you're doing a great job or pokes you in the chest and says you're doing a horrible job. At this point, I'll take any of it just because it's tough. And of course, due to that, we have to recognize, of course, that we're probably going to be close to 600,000 deaths before this pandemic is over. And that's an extraordinary magnitude. It was mentioned today that's already a greater number than was lost by Americans in the First World War and the Second World War. And we're going to end up with numbers similar to the Civil War. So for anyone who's experienced such a loss, our thoughts are with you today. And I look back and I thought about, as a county commissioner and as a member of Congress, the things I've talked about with you and what to talk about today. I talked to you about government reform, reinventing government, national security, China, and legislative updates. It's really hard to think of this last year and just think of it in terms of an update, right? I mean, once in a century pandemic, an election that's really going to transform this country, the dramatic difference between the two people running, the care packages, the rescue packages that we've passed in the meantime, the normal domestic and foreign threats and actions that have taken place in our country, and of course, the insurrection. And to paraphrase the line from Hamilton, yes, I was in the room where some of that happened. So it's one of the things I want to talk about today. It's hard to get past that, not just because of its historical significance, but because of its political importance and the threat that exists in our country. I just left an open hearing with leaders of the intelligence community, and I'm going to have to leave a little before the top of the hour to go to a classified version of that. One of the things that FBI Director Wray has informed us in recent days has been that there is now a greater danger of domestic terrorism than those from foreign threats. Be of mind that we are probably disproportionately spending money at this time and resources on those foreign threats. So I want you to keep that in mind as we talk about that day, because for all of us, even those not there, it was probably the greatest threat to our Constitution since the founding of the Republic. The United States building was ransacked, looted, occupied for the first time since the War of 1812. An angry mob threatened them. I just want folks to think about this. Number 2, 3, and 4 in succession. Right? If you're going to have a coup, they were all within feet of each other, and the risk was real. Well, a police officer was murdered. Several others died since that day, and 140 officers were injured by the mob. This was a domestic attack on a scale we haven't had anything like this, I suspect, since the Oklahoma City bombing, which was more than 25 years ago. So typically when you talk about a story like this, you say it began as just a normal day. Nothing at all normal about this. And for me, it was the night before. I rode my bike to the Capitol out of curiosity, and then I walked around with my bike. And even then you could see and could tell who was there by what they wore and what they were saying. They were all wearing Trump paraphernalia, and they were talking about lynching the Vice President of the United States and shooting the Speaker of the House and threatening members and kidnapping them. It was all within earshot of Capitol Police. So put yourself in my place. Your assumption is they hear this. They know there's a threat, right? So move to the next day, and I did pretty much the same thing that morning, but obviously the crowds were much larger, incredibly, even more angry. I looked out over the East Capitol steps and I saw a gentleman speaking to a pretty large crowd. This wasn't the big crowd by the eclipse. This was a pretty large crowd on the other side of the Capitol. And if you just watched his mannerisms, he looked like a minister speaking to the flock, but he was angry and he was advocating something. And he got closer, he was advocating attacking the Capitol. And again, within earshot. So I went back into my office and talked to my staff about it. And about that time, before the debate began on the Electoral College, it was going to be challenged, the president arrived at the demonstration and was going to speak. Now, not every station had his audio on, and I finally flipped it, and I think it was OAN or whatever they call this station, and you could hear the president speak. I got to tell you, people have taken that out of context, but if you were in the moment and you were there, and then you saw the president speak, it was very obvious. I said, uh-oh. And then, the debate was supposed to start, somewhat like 1-ish or 2 o'clock. I went over by there to join a joint session of Congress to do what was, again, a ceremonial opening Electoral College. And I looked one last time over the East Capitol steps and saw a huge crowd. And I saw 3 Capitol police officers, none of them with riot gear, none of them with Kevlar helmets or masks or what have you. And I texted a couple of my staff that we're not ready for this. We don't have enough security. So I entered the chambers, and again, it was a joint session, but not as large as a normal joint session because of COVID, we were going to break up. And since I wasn't going to be part of the first state's debate, they asked some of us to go up in the balcony, which is kind of a rough choice as it turns out. You know, you go forward about an hour, hour and a half into the debate. The first sense, if you were a member, that something was wrong, something was different, was that they came and they whisked leadership off the floor, Democrat and Republican, McCarthy and Nancy Pelosi, and others. What we didn't know at this time was that the Capitol had been attacked, and they had already evacuated the Senate. And for reasons that defy description, they did not evacuate the House immediately. Mr. McGovern took the podium, and the debate continued, just oblivious to the threat that existed. And a short time later, Mr. McGovern interrupted the debate and said, he informed us that the Capitol had been breached and the protesters were in Statutory Hall, which is, for those of you who have been here, 6 feet from the House floor. And then he instructed us that tear gas had been sprayed and that we should get our gas mask on. Now, tear gas mask on. Now, everyone said, what tear gas mask? Turns out there's one under every seat. Little did we know. Not having had one on for over 40 years, this was a challenge, and for many, it wasn't going to happen. At that point, they were evacuating the House floor. Not everyone left. The problem, as we had moved up in the balcony to space out, is that we were trapped. So then, you know, you start to recognize there's a very real threat here. You could hear bangs, you could hear shouts, you could hear breaking glass, and you know, for whatever reason, I was actually got on a phone call with WGN television, so a lot of this can be recounted just watching the tape. Why you do that, you never know. You know, it's hard to explain what you're doing in circumstances like that. I was asked later, were you afraid? And I don't remember being afraid. I don't remember thinking I was brave. You're just reacting in time to what's taking place and what you need to do. I do remember being really, really angry. Something that wasn't told was when it really broke, I heard some of my colleagues yelling at the Republicans, you know, you did this, this is your fault, which was the beginning, I guess, of a deeper rift that exists within us now. And I remember also hearing a gunshot to my left, which would have been the speaker's lobby. And what I didn't know was that was when one of the protesters attempted to enter the speaker's lobby and she was shot and killed. I can't tell you that we knew the exact scope of the threat while this was going on. You could see, and the fact that they were telling us to get down below our seats to avoid line of sight indicates there was a real danger. But, you know, I suspect it would have been a lot different had we been able to see the video from all over the Capitol of what was taking place and the way the police were being, you know, horribly abused. So at some point, they moved us out to the far other side of the balcony, and I heard a police officer say, we got to go. We got to make a run for it. And one was questioning if it was safe enough. But there we went, and I could see to my right as we left, prone protesters with guns drawn on them. And they sent us, a small group of us, down a stairway that I had not been down before. And then we lost the police. Sort of striking. The evacuation, unfortunately, didn't go all that well. I was in the front, and we didn't know what door to open, right? How far down do you go? Where's our safe hiding place? And I remember thinking, which door has the tiger behind it? The old parable that we read as kids. I just decided to go down to the last door and went to our left. And I remember walking with a member who had a cane because she had had surgery. And she said, I don't want to slow you down so that they catch up with us. And I remember Brad Schneider and I, you know, walking with her. I said, we're going to stay with you, but I may need to borrow that cane. And we got to our hiding place. And let me tell you something that struck me as I look back at this and put this in the bigger perspective of why this telling of the story matters. I remember doing a radio hit while we were in this hiding place, secure place. And I said, what do you suppose it tells the rest of the world that I have to secure a place while I wait for the National Guard so I can go vote for a peaceful transfer of power? But as I look back and I think about this, January 6th was a culmination, right? For weeks, the president had talked about this. He had spread the big lie about the election. He had incited them, talked about coming to D.C. and what they should do. So, while the events of January 6th were shocking, in the end, they shouldn't have been a surprise. And we're going to learn in the weeks and months to come just why there were intelligence failures and, what we still need to do. And that's part of what I want to talk about. And I do want to leave a lot of time for questions for this. Where do we go from here? Ed and I were talking before this discussion began, and what do we need to do to protect the Capitol first, right? I got to tell you, while I was up there, I heard one of my colleagues say when they broke the glass, and you've seen that photograph of the doors that the President of the United States comes in to give the State of the Union address. And all keeping us from the mob was like bookcases and chairs and stray furniture, just beyond belief, and guns drawn. And when they broke through the glass, I heard a member say, where's the effing cavalry? Indeed, at that point, there was no cavalry, but you could pretty much figure out, sitting up on that balcony at that point, what we needed to do, right? I had seen that they had used bicycle racks as protective barriers around the Capitol. Police officers didn't have, clearly most of them didn't have the protective equipment, but we knew then we needed a larger police force, better trained, better equipped. There's a report that came out today that details this, but you could tell it that day. And the videos are extremely hard to watch of those officers and their heroic efforts to keep us safe. Ill-prepared, ill-trained, ill-equipped, outnumbered, without a protective barrier. And I know no one wants an ugly fence around the Congress for all time, but the tragic death of yet another officer at the barricade a week ago, most likely would not have taken place had there been another additional barrier beyond that. So we've got to get the security down before we think about aesthetics. Aesthetics matter. The fact that this is the people's house and people should be free to get here matters, but we have to make this functioning democracy safe, because that has extraordinary value. We also need better communication, better coordination, better intel, and we need an understanding with the National Guard. And you've read about, the investigations will go into greater detail, just what happened with the National Guard and the tragic delays that took place. It's also an argument for DC statehood, because usually governors can just call out the National Guard. That wasn't allowed to happen, had to go through the Pentagon, and again, hours were lost and lives were put at risk. Our country was put at risk as a result of that. And again, there were intelligence failures. We're going to get to the root of that. I think the larger issue here is the fact that we need to have a greater mindset focused on domestic terrorism and its threats, whatever the motivations. But clearly the president inciting this is the reason it happened. And the president has to be held accountable, and anyone else who was involved. I just have to read this statistic, though, that bothers me. Early this month, new polling revealed that 55% of the Republicans today believe the riot was started by, quote, violent left-wing protesters trying to make President Trump look bad. 55%. What else do we need to do? Um, you know, once this happened, many of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle went from denouncing the hatred espoused by President Trump with his candidacy who seemed doomed to fail to, in a sense, grinning and bearing it, or even amplifying it when his political base became, in their minds, indispensable to their reelection. And there, it was a quick jump from parroting extremist conspiracy theories and promoting misinformation. That became an easy jump to make. And I recognize that many of my colleagues spoke at the rally, talked about that, gave them fist bumps. There will be an investigation. I know that the Justice Department seems to be looking at this as far as whether there was greater involvement by my colleagues prior to this. And they seem to be less focused on this than other activities that took place across this country. I am as concerned as anyone with any violence that takes place in this country, but to diminish the impact of what took place on January 6th is a real mistake. This has to be bipartisan, the final analysis. I often say what gets done best in this country and this government gets done in the middle. A consensus is growing that initiatives that harness our government's unique ability to step in and improve people's lives in times of crisis, that has to happen on a bipartisan basis. That consensus on issues that really matter should be what's driving the force behind the bipartisan policymaking in Congress. Beyond Congress alone, we need to move away from the us versus them paradigm, obviously driven pretty dramatically by President Trump. So, what can do that? And I think one of the obvious ones is infrastructure. This could be the subject of a whole nother address, folks, what we need to do to rebuild our country. But I'll remind everyone who says, well, look, we're in an economic downturn. Can we afford this? In the midst of the Depression, we dreamed big and built bigger, right? This was an extraordinary time. It was then viewed, as it should be, as an investment, not just an expenditure. How many of us who are on this call sent their kids to schools and park district facilities that are 75 to 100 years old? I would just say, if not now, when? I get it. Our nation has always been polarized from the days of Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. We're still there, but we can't continue the hate and the misinformation that's been spread for political gain that really moves extremism and violence. We need to invest in bringing each other together. My staff told me the best way to describe it, and I just have to give them credit, is think about it as moral infrastructure. So we need to build our infrastructure our physical infrastructure at the same time we rebuild our moral infrastructure. And as we see the light at the end of the pandemic, we have a chance to aspire about what our country needs to be. It's going to take all of us, Democrats and Republicans alike, to really rally together and end the scourge of misinformation and extremism that have become a stain on our country. I think it's going to take courage at times to do that, but we have to do this. We have to use January 6th. Those that lost their lives and the risk that took place can't be in vain. It has to be for some greater good. So as always, it's a pleasure to join the City Club again this year. I want to thank you for letting me speak to you. I wanted to give you plenty of time to ask questions. I guess it's time to stump the Congressman.
Congressman, we have a question from one of your constituents here, someone whom you're familiar with, Chester Kropodlowski, very active with Lakeview citizens groups. And he sends us this question from Diversey Harbor, where he's probably perch fishing. He wants to know about the North Lakeshore Drive redefining the drive project. Will it be a candidate for new infrastructure bill monies?
When I've talked about the infrastructure bill with the governor, the mayor, the county board president, our great state reps and state senators, aldermen, county commissioners, and the public, I tell folks, don't think about small things. Resurfacing streets is important, but they're going to have to be resurfaced again in 3 to 4 years. We got to think transformative. We got to think Lakeshore Drive. You've got to think rebuilding our lakeshore because of the ravages of climate change. This is maybe a once in a lifetime opportunity to change the face of not just Chicago, but the region and the whole country. One of the reasons you've got to think like this is it makes us economically competitive with our rivals, India, China, Europe, just as a few examples. They're outspending us 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1 on infrastructure. And they're using this to be competitively, have a competitive economic advantage against us. So when we think of this, think transformative, think what's going to change the face of our country and what is it that's going to take the stress off of state and local governments financially. So, and what's going to help us address climate change? What's going to help us meet? The pandemic reflected to all of us the fact that there's a great divide of haves and have-nots in our country. So let's rebuild. Let's end the digital divide in this country. Let's rebuild the grid system in this country. So again, we don't have the disasters as we did in Texas, and we can do so in an efficient manner to address climate change. So don't think small, think big. Think about the things that are going to take us into the next century, not the last century.
Thank you. Congressman, we have a question here from City Club member Sheila Weinberg with Truth in Accounting. The question is, your House Oversight Committee has jurisdiction over the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. It uses its standards to prepare its budget. Should the committee review standards that have allowed Illinois, to claim balanced budgets while going over $200 billion in debt? Your thoughts on this matter, Congressman?
Yeah, I think I got most of it. Look, and let me talk about the state of local and state governments nationally and what we're trying to do. I see my job on appropriations as drawing resources back to take some of the economic pressure off of state and local governments. You know, I heard Mitch McConnell say that Illinois and the blue states, it's a blue state bailout, the care and rescue packages we did. You know, and I know where Illinois is funded at, but Kentucky is funded 5 points below. Couple that with the fact that no state, no local government, and very few businesses have not been absolutely ravaged by the COVID and the economic downturn that came from it. So I want states, particularly my state, to operate the most efficient way possible. But I see my primary function is to take some of that pressure off. When if it comes to some sort of future carrot and stick approach, where we encourage states to operate in the most appropriate way possible to help them out with these issues, you know, fine. But for right now, during the middle of a crisis, what I want to have happen is the state, local government to use the money that is the most responsible way forward. And I saw Mayor Lightfoot was going to use much of the money she got from the federal government to address that debt that she had to take on due to the COVID. You know, that's fine. We are getting a very tricky wicket when we start telling 50 states and thousands of local governments exactly how to use these resources, especially during a crisis.
Congressman, this question relates to redistricting. When will redistricting take effect? For which of the upcoming elections will there be new districts? And do you feel that Illinois, which has been mentioned as losing one congressman, but perhaps two, what's your opinion? Will we be down one congressman or two congressmen?
Sure. Well, look, I think Illinois is probably going to lose at least one congressional seat. It's less likely that it loses two, and that change will take place. It should take place where the population decline was most involved. whatever's fair and whatever's proportional. My understanding, the General Assembly is starting to look at these maps now. I don't know if they're going to do their own first. I do know that they don't have all of the data they normally would because of the delays. So at some point in time, that information will get to them. What's interesting to me in that is it is conceivable that they not have all this in time that might impact the timing of the primary election. I'm not the one to make that decision. How this is all going to affect Illinois. Obviously, a loss of a seat is a big loss. Loss of population is significant in terms of federal funding. Gets to the bigger issues of redistricting. The fact of the matter is, we ought to do this uniformly across the country. We ought to have one way of doing this where it is judged as extremely fair and not just for political reasons. So the Republicans won the majority of the General Assemblies. We're concerned with how maps are drawn in all 50 states, but the fact that they won the General Assemblies will have some bearing as to how those maps are drawn. And frankly, most pundits will tell you, give them an edge in the next congressional elections that take place in 2 years. So this census will impact the next congressional election.
This question is from Susan Evans, City Club member. She wants to know if the president will ever be held accountable. How do we fix, quote unquote, that 55% of the American public believe the lies over election fraud that led to perhaps the January 6th insurrection? How do we redirect Congress to get back to the center? Is there a future for bipartisanship? Susan Evans feels it's so disconcerting that there is no middle anymore.
I share the concern. The middle gets pushed to the sides in some respects. Let's look at the reasons. I think one of the big reasons that we lose centrist is because the maps are drawn to protect incumbents, and incumbents are not worried about general elections for the most part as much as often. I'm not saying definitively, but as much as often as they are worried about primaries. So they're worried about primaries. They're going to stay on their side, right? And the folks that campaign and lobby for interest involving primary elections, they tend to pressure to move folks to the extremes. A lot of the Republican centrists I used to work with are gone, and they're replaced by farther right centrists. Farther right members who are just not in the mood to compromise. As I said when this started, things tend to get done in the middle here. If there's no middle, we have a problem. How do we deal with 55% who believe such things? I think in the end, it deals with misinformation. How we balance looking at how Americans get their information, how the platforms judge this, what is indeed fake news, and how are people educated about that. I was a big part of the Russian investigation from day one. And, what struck me was why were the Russians so successful in 2016? In the final analysis, a large part of that has to be attributed to the fact that we were so willing to accept the worst in each other. We were so willing to accept all those things that divide us. So the fire was there, they just poured gasoline on it. So in the end, a lot of this is on us. Some of it's civics education, addressing misinformation, and appreciating this. When you look at the last time this country was so polarized during the Civil War, Lincoln spoke in a reconciliatory manner, right? In the second inaugural, he's talked about with malice toward none, with charity for all. He referenced the scriptures. He was doing so because he was addressing us in a manner in which we are accustomed to appeal to the better angels of our nature. You don't see a lot of that today. It tends to reinforce those angers that are out there. When I answer that question, when I'm talking to high school students, I ask them to read To Kill a Mockingbird, if only because the main character and the theme of what Atticus Finch is trying to say is you have to walk around in the other person's skin for a while to really understand. It's clear that we are not doing that today.
This question, Congressman, is from Dorothy Green. Dorothy wants to know what you and Congress are prepared to do to protect transgender people in Illinois and the United States as more and more states pass bills that target young transgender Americans.
Yeah, and I'm proud to be part of the caucus, one of the co-founders of the caucus to protect the trans community. First of all, the House passed the Equality Act, and we've done it twice now. It has to become the law of the land. Part of this has to be education, has to be people speaking out, pushing law enforcement to do the right thing to make sure we address hate crimes at an adequate level. I always felt that the trans community was left behind in the evolution of equality. And it's only been recently that I see that the interest is genuinely there to make sure they're part of every move forward. So it has to be part of that effort. And passing equality measures in the Senate has to be a priority. And it gets to an issue we haven't touched on, and that's the filibuster. I understand the dynamic of people pushing back on getting rid of the filibuster. I think at the very least, and I don't have a vote on it, it must be painful. Most Americans look at the filibuster and they think of Jimmy Stewart and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's nothing like that. So at the very least, we have to make the filibuster extremely difficult so that legislation can go forward. And I would say the trigger point is this: if we aren't going to be given a chance to have bipartisan assistance on issues like equality and climate change and reasonable gun measures and infrastructure from my Republican colleagues, then you really don't have much choice than to move forward on what would be entirely a democratic process of making the filibuster, at the very least, almost impossible to use.
Congressman Quigley, this question is from Joseph Lane. Rather appropriate considering our quarterly estimated taxes are due within a few days on April 17th. Joe's question is, the IRS is quite understaffed. The cost to taxpayers 4 years ago was reported at $400 billion a year. Perhaps this year as much as $1 trillion a year. Will anything be done to bring the IRS up to the staffing levels that they should be at?
Yeah, it's my committee that funds the IRS, my subcommittee. I chair it. I have tried very hard to dramatically increase those resources out of genuine fairness, right? No one has disputed a couple things, that they're understaffed. And bizarrely, the fact is that people of modest means are audited by the IRS more than people who are particularly wealthy. It makes no sense. It should be equal and fair above the board, but they don't have the resources. We've also taxed the IRS with many additional responsibilities, and including tax credits, changes in the tax law, passing out stimulus, and so forth. There's so much more out there. If anything, because of all that, they need additional resources to answer people's questions, to let them understand what the law is, and to enforce this equally. I think the number is closer to $1 trillion, and that cheats us all. When people aren't paying their fair share, and we have a tax gap like we do, up to $1 trillion, we could be using that money to pay down our debt, to keep us safe, to help every American reach opportunities, education, healthcare, and so forth. So it has to be a priority. I am very pleased to see in the so-called skinny budget that the president released last week that he has dramatically increased the resources made available to the IRS. He will see a willing and friendly. He will have a friendly reception to this from myself, and I do believe the Democratic caucus to pass that increase out of the House.
Congressman, this question is from Lawrence Masal, the head of the Civic Federation of Chicago. He says, "Thank you, Congressman. Your leadership in helping to secure federal revenue support for states and cities is greatly appreciated." Lawrence asks, will there be any federal incentives to prod Illinois to modernize how it delivers and manages transit and transportation services, and how the state and region prioritizes its infrastructure investments?
Sure. Look, I'm about to go into a hearing on Intel domestic threats, but right after that, we're meeting with the new transportation secretary, and I'm going to encourage him to do just what you say. And he seems to be ready to go. This has to be transit for the next century, not the last. We've got a lot of challenges here to do what you're talking about, but it's the right thing to do. One is, coming out of COVID, how do we get everybody back into transit? There's work to be done there. It's not going to be easy. But this economy, I saw an editorial about a week ago in which they questioned whether we'll ever get back to normal on transit. If transit doesn't get back to normal, the economy will never get back to normal. The two go hand in hand. In a large urban area like this, I appreciate the fact that more people will be working remotely, but to get this economy full-fledged back in gear, the transit systems have to be operating, and there's a lot of work to be done. What are we, several trillion down nationally on what we have to do there. And I'll make a plug here. There's a longer answer, but we don't have time for it. I'll make a plug here that part of that's going to be renewing the effort for high-speed rail, right? And what this could do for Chicago as the middle of those, of those crosses where you have high-speed rail from Detroit to St. Louis, for example, and farther, and from the Twin Cities through Chicago all the way to Atlanta and even farther. So I think we end on an optimistic note. This is the stuff that can transform our country, make us competitive. It can unite us. It can grow the economy, and it can do so in which everybody has an opportunity to be part of that, not only in the rebuilding, but enjoying the benefits of rebuilding, as we rebuild and extend the red line, for example. So as that's the final question, I want to thank you all for having me back. It is indeed an honor to be with you again. I look forward to an opportunity to have Italian next time as we go back to in place and people pat me on the back or poke me in the chest. I miss the human touch.
Thank you, Congressman.
Serve you, and thanks, everyone.
Congressman Quigley, we really thank you for taking time from your busy schedule. We know that you have a worldwide threat assessment committee meeting within just a few minutes, and you're going to run over there. We want to let you know that hopefully next year when you come back, it will be in person and you can have that great Italian lunch if we're back at our regular clubhouse, Maggiano's. Thank you very much, and we wish you and your colleagues nothing but the best.